Renly Baratheon allowed himself a moment of laughter, a soft peal of sound that bubbled out of him as his inner circle gathered in his extravagant campaign pavilion. The light from the torches bathed the interior in a warm glow, highlighting the rich tapestries and the swirling patterns on the floor. Outside, the wind whispered through the leafy camp, and the murmuring of soldiers betrayed both their hopes for the coming battles and their fears of the unknown. Renly, however, seemed unburdened by any sense of impending danger. His bright eyes flickered over the men and women around him, and his handsome face, framed by thick, dark hair, was lit with confidence. He was a king in the making, or so he believed. Having staked his claim to the Iron Throne after his elder brother, Robert Baratheon, had died, Renly was determined to press his suit with the greatest alliance he could forge. He had the support of the Tyrells, the host of the Stormlands, and a great measure of charm. With these, he hoped to overshadow the claim of his brother Stannis. Though older, Stannis lacked the warmth and popularity that Renly exuded so naturally. The younger Baratheon had grown used to the attention and admiration, wearing them like a well-fitted cloak. Across from him stood Margaery Tyrell, his queen by name and alliance. She was poised, her expression calmly appraising him. There was a quiet, thoughtful intelligence behind her large eyes. She observed Renly's casual confidence with a mixture of fondness and concern, for she knew that war spares no man's vanity. Still, she believed in him and trusted in her brother Loras's unwavering devotion to his cause. Her devotion, whether more to family or to Renly himself, manifested in her tireless efforts to strengthen their position. She reached out and placed a hand on Renly's arm, guiding him gently away from the swirl of conversation toward a corner of the pavilion. "My lord," she said softly, "you must rest. The hour is late, and the men have an early start if we are to march. Even a king needs his sleep." Renly gave a smile that showed he welcomed her concern. "I appreciate your worry, my lady, though you might find me more stubborn than I appear. A king who sleeps too much runs the risk of missing his own battles." He paused, eyes glimmering, as he turned his attention around the tent one more time. "But you are right. I will allow myself a short respite. I'll have to speak with Brienne of Tarth before I retire, though. She has proven to be a most loyal guardian." Mention of Brienne invoked a certain hush in Margaery's tone. The Tyrell queen inclined her head, her expression betraying respect for the tall, formidable woman sworn to Renly. "You have placed much trust in her, my lord," Margaery said carefully. Renly nodded. "She may not be the sort of knight our realm is used to, but she is unwavering in her devotion." He gestured to a corner of the pavilion, where Brienne stood silently, her posture rigid, her face set in a constant stoic watchfulness. She was taller than many men, broad-shouldered in her armor, her hair the color of straw. Her features were plain, often mocked, but Renly saw in her eyes a sincerity that many knights lacked. "I trust her with my life," he declared, loud enough that several knights in earshot paused to glance at him. "She saved me in the melee. I owe her that recognition." Brienne's cheeks flushed slightly as the attention fell on her, but she did not lower her gaze. She only inclined her head to Renly, the faintest hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. As the gathering began to wind down, knights filed out of the pavilion to take their posts or retire to their own tents. Margaery departed with her retinue, leaving Renly with a handful of his most trusted guards, among them Brienne. Loras Tyrell had already left to see to some final matter of security. Renly, feeling the weight of the evening, beckoned Brienne closer. "You've been standing there all evening," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "You must be tired." She shook her head. "I am sworn to protect you, my lord. Tiredness doesn't matter. My vow is my life." Renly's smile was genuine. "I would insist that you rest, but I have learned it's useless to argue with you. Very well, stay if you must. But know that I rest easier knowing you keep watch." Brienne nodded, her eyes never leaving him. She watched as he stepped behind a partition in the pavilion, where a comfortable bed had been prepared. Her senses were alert. Though the camp was secure, Though men loyal to House Baratheon and House Tyrell surrounded the tent, she refused to let her guard down. If any threat approached, she would be ready. The night wore on, and only the occasional sound of patrolling soldiers or a distant neigh from the horse lines broke the silence. The torchlight flickered, creating dancing shadows across the pavilion walls. Brienne's thoughts drifted to the moment Renly had given her the right to wear his rainbow cloak, the moment he named her to his Kingsguard. She had never known such acceptance. Most mocked her appearance and derided her dreams of knighthood as foolish. Yet Renly had seen the earnestness in her and bestowed upon her the honor she had craved. Her devotion to him was absolute, perhaps fueled by gratitude, perhaps by something deeper that she couldn't quite name. She forced her eyes to remain sharp. The night was quiet, but she knew that war drew cunning and desperate actions from all corners. Then, in the stillness, she felt it. A prickle along her skin, as though the night's air had turned stale. She pivoted, scanning the pavilion. Nothing, not a sound save for Renly's measured breathing. But the sensation of menace clung to her, pressing in on her mind like an unseen hand. Her entire body tensed. She gripped the hilt of her sword. The cloak she wore shifted around her tall figure as she took a slow step. A black shape, darker than the night's gloom, seemed to stretch across the floor of the tent. It was a fluid thing, like living shadow, twisting and lengthening, creeping toward the partition where Renly slept. It was not shaped like a person entirely, but rather a shifting silhouette, vaguely human at times, then contorting into something formless. Brienne froze at the sight, horror pulsing in her veins. She had seen many things on the battlefield, but never a living shadow. She called out, "My lord!" Her voice sounded harsh in the hush, and she realized she was more afraid than she had ever been in her life. She sprang forward, drawing her sword. The shadow figure flinched away from the sudden movement, but then resumed its path with a terrifying sureness. She heard Renly stir behind the partition, but he could not possibly grasp the danger quickly enough. In the corner of her eye, she saw him stepping around the bed, dressed only in a light shift, his hair tousled. "Brienne?" he began to ask, confusion in his voice. That was all he managed before the shadow sprang at him, a blackness that formed a blade-like limb. Brienne lunged into its path, her sword meeting the intangible darkness. She felt resistance, though faint, as if she were slicing through thick smoke. A high-pitched wail, not quite human, filled her ears, and the swirling darkness recoiled. She understood nothing but that she had to stand between it and Renly. Her heart pounded. The shadow swiped at her again, and she brought her sword up, muscles trembling with the effort. Part of her mind screamed that this could not be real, that no mortal blade should clash with living shadow. But her vow was real, her loyalty was real, and so she fought. Renly stumbled backward, eyes widening in disbelief. He saw the swirling mass of darkness, saw how it tried to surge around Brienne. He saw Brienne's broad back rise and fall with each desperate breath as she parried the impossible. "Guards!" he shouted, finding his voice. "Guards!" But the creature seemed intent on finishing its deadly mission before help could arrive. Its formless edges slipped around Brienne's left flank, forming the silhouette of an arm wielding a dagger of pure shadow. With a grunt, Brienne twisted, swinging her sword in a wide arc. Though it was no living flesh and blood, the shadow hissed in pain or rage, staggering sideways. Brienne advanced, refusing to allow it an inch of ground toward Renly. Outside, footsteps pounded, and the tent's entrance flung open. A pair of guards rushed in, swords drawn. They, too, froze at the sight of the formless attacker. One cried out in alarm, while the other seemed too shocked to speak. In that heartbeat of confusion, the shadow propelled itself forward one last time, aiming directly at Renly with horrifying precision. Brienne threw herself in front of him, raising her sword. The shadow's blade, if it could be called that, met the steel, and an unholy screech erupted as if something in the creature's essence tore. The living darkness shuddered, lost cohesion, and slid away from Brienne's blade as if torn apart by the wind. Within seconds, it dissipated into nothingness, leaving only the stench of coldness behind. For a single instant, nobody moved. Renly stared, his chest heaving, gaze pinned on the spot where the shadow had vanished. The two guards still stood by the entrance, wide-eyed and pale. Brienne remained in a crouch, sword outstretched, her limbs trembling. She could scarcely believe what had just happened. The thing had tried to kill Renly. She had seen real hatred in that twisting shape. Had she hesitated a second later, it would have succeeded. "My lord," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "Are you hurt?" Renly took a moment to recover from his shock. Then he drew in a breath. No, I'm unhurt." He turned to the guards, a slight tremor in his voice. "Sound the alarm. There may be sorcery at work here. Summon my knights. I want watchers posted outside every entrance." The guards sprang into action, almost grateful to have an order to follow, and hurried out. Brienne risked a glance at Renly, who looked as though 100 questions were battering against the inside of his mind. She knew the feeling, her own thoughts were ablaze. They had just survived something unearthly. "What was that?" Renly asked, voice hushed. "Was it truly a living shadow?" Brienne hesitated, her grip still on her sword hilt. "I do not know, my lord, but I believe it came here with the intent to end your life." Even as she spoke, she felt a chill run through her. The black shape, with its hunger to kill, had reminded her of rumors. Talk of dark magics, witches, and sorcerers rumored to exist across the seas. But she had never seen such a thing in Westeros, not until now. Renly shivered, though the night was warm within the canvas walls. "Brienne," he said, an unmistakable gratitude in his voice. "You saved me. I owe you my life." He looked around, trying to impose order in his confusion. "I have to call my lords. They must know. If Stannis is behind this..." His brow creased. Of all the possibilities swirling in his mind, the most likely was that Stannis or his Red Priestess had somehow orchestrated this unimaginable attack. Brienne nodded, though she knew this was only the beginning. She had saved Renly's life, but she had a feeling the attempt would not be the last. Whatever power conjured that shadow would not be easily dissuaded. Her vow ran deeper now than ever, for not only was she bound by honor, but she had witnessed a horror that threatened Renly's life in ways she had never foreseen. She glanced at him and saw a mixture of determination and fear. His pride, though formidable, had taken a shaking blow. Soon, the tent was filled with knights and sworn swords. Ser Loras Tyrell burst in, his face pale with worry, Marjorie right behind him, her hair loose around her shoulders. The others arrived in various states of readiness, some still half-dressed in their nightclothes, others pulling on armor as they rushed in. The guards relayed hurried accounts of the nightmare they had glimpsed. Whispers of dark sorcery and references to the Red Woman passed from lip to lip. Renly recounted what had happened as best he could, though he left the fighting to Brienne's explanation. Her voice was level, though the memory of the shadow's screech still pounded in her ears. Some looked at Brienne with newfound respect. Others seemed unsettled, even fearful of her, as if her act of cutting down the living shadow made her somehow more than a mere mortal. Loras, for his part, seemed torn between relief that Renly was safe and a measure of barely concealed jealousy that Brienne had been the one to stand between the king and death. Regardless of the complicated swirl of emotions, everyone realized the ramifications. Stannis Baratheon, or someone in his service, was dabbling in the darkest form of magic to eliminate his rivals. This was no mere political maneuver. It was an abomination in the eyes of gods and men alike. "We march at dawn," Renly finally declared, his voice carrying authority despite the tremor of shock lingering at the edges. "We cannot wait for another attempt. If Stannis or his Red Priestess can conjure such things, we must strike before they do it again." He paused, looking at the lords surrounding him. He saw flashes of fear, uncertainty, but mostly a desire to act. "This is war," he concluded softly. "And it seems war has turned dark indeed." Before everyone dispersed, Renly paused to speak privately with Brienne. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and though she towered over him, he seemed every inch a king in that moment. "You have my deepest gratitude, Sir Brienne." She felt heat rise to her cheeks at the honorific, for she was not truly a knight. But she did not contradict him. "It is my duty," she said simply, her voice still husky from the intensity of the night. "I will protect you until my last breath." A ghost of a smile flickered across Renly's face. "I hope it never comes to that." Then, with a last glance at the torn partition and the flickering torchlight, he left with Marjorie and Loras, heading to the command tent to plan their next move. Brienne stood where she was, her sword still in hand, and she wondered if any measure of steel would be enough to hold back the nightmares to come. The camp was stirred to a frenzy for the remainder of the night. Guards doubled their patrols, and lords met in secret huddles, speaking in hushed tones about the unnatural attack. Rumors spread like wildfire, twisting into all manner of wild accusations. The Red Woman Melisandre was on everyone's lips. Some claimed she was a demon. Others whispered she was a prophet of the Lord of Light. No one knew the truth, only that dark magic had nearly claimed their king that night, and only Brienne's swift intervention had saved him. The hush of fear blended with the rustle of anger, forging a new resolve in Renly's camp. When dawn broke, it was a gray, subdued light that filtered through the low clouds. A fine drizzle dampened the banners bearing the golden stag of House Baratheon and the golden rose of House Tyrell. Yet the mood in the camp was one of urgency. Knights strapped on their armor with grim purpose. Archers prepared arrows, silent and cold-faced. Squires ran to and fro, carrying messages and arms. The air was thick with anticipation, and more than once, Brienne caught glimpses of men crossing themselves with superstitious gestures, as if warding off evil. Renly oversaw preparations from his own command area, flanked by Marjorie, Loras, and his other lieutenants. Brienne remained always at his side, watchful. She barely blinked, and though fatigue pulled at her eyes, she forced herself to remain alert. She remembered too well the moment of the Shadow's attack, and she could not shake the lingering dread that there might be another such attempt. Renly insisted on speaking to the men before they marched. He donned his cloak of vibrant green, pinned at the shoulder with a golden stag, and rode his warhorse to the gathering lines of soldiers. Shouts of recognition and appreciation echoed through the camp. King Renly Baratheon, young and handsome, the man many believed could unite the realm through charm and alliances rather than bloodshed. He drew them in, lending hope where fear had taken hold. Brienne rode beside him, her massive figure and determined expression a visible reminder that their king had protectors even from the darkest of threats. Renly's voice rang out, clear and firm. "Soldiers of the Stormlands, allies of the Reach, my brothers in arms. Last night, a vile sorcery was unleashed against us. Against me, your king. But we are still here. We remain unbroken, unbowed by the darkness that seeks to snuff out the rightful pursuit of justice and order in the realm. Some wish to cower behind shadows and twisted magic to make us bend a knee. But we will not kneel. We will not be intimidated. By night's end, we will strike at those who engage in these abominations." A roar of agreement rippled through the ranks. Even those who had once been uneasy about going to war against Stannis seemed resolute now, galvanized by their hatred of the shadowy treachery. Brienne could feel the surge of support, even as her heart hammered with the realization that they rode to face an enemy who may possess the power to kill from afar. If it had not been for her quick action, Renly would be dead. How many others might fall if this sorcery was unleashed again? Still, there was no time to waste. Renly led the march. Thousands of men in plate and mail, carrying spears, swords, and longbows, emerged from the wide meadow that had served as their camp. The mud squelched underfoot in the early drizzle, horses whinnying as they trotted forward. Standards snapped in the wind, proud golden stags and roses shining through the gloom. Marjorie remained behind with her retinue, for she had to manage supplies and certain strategic responsibilities. But Loras rode near his king, wearing brilliant armor adorned with the Tyrell rose. He shared brief words with Brienne, though his expression remained stiff. She wondered if he felt a pang of guilt or envy that he had not been the one to save Renly from the assassin. In Loras's gaze, there was confusion toward her, but she could also sense his respect. It took most of the morning to get the full host on the move. Renly's plan was to march east toward Storm's End, where, according to his scouts, Stannis was preparing for a siege or an open battle. The tension was palpable. Many hoped that facing Stannis directly on the battlefield would level the playing field. Steel against steel, man against man, rather than suffer more hidden attacks. Yet the image of that shifting shadow haunted them all, even if unspoken. No one knew if Stannis would unleash another such horror, or how. Whispers began to swirl about whether Melisandre was with him, and if so, what unnatural powers she carried within her. Brienne stayed close to Renly. She studied the horizon, the plains, the hills, any possible vantage. She had never known such vigilance. Even her previous experiences on the battlefield seemed trivial compared to the sense of looming danger that now consumed her. Renly remained outwardly calm. He spoke confidently to his lords, discussing formations and siege engines, giving pep talks to knights who fretted about the weather or the readiness of their allies. In private moments, he confided in Brienne that he was frightened, not just for himself, but for the men who might face a type of sorcery none of them understood. She did her best to steady him, though her own fears churned beneath her stoic exterior.